Yep, we're good.
I don't think these are in any order.
So I think I would answer that question in two ways. I think that there currently is not enough money given to the school budget. So if you look at the Michigan state budget, for example, I think it's been cut 12% over the last 3 years. And you might ask, where has that money gone in terms of the state budget? So the state claims that there isn't enough money, that times are hard, but when you look at where the money has gone, there's also simultaneously there's been huge tax cuts for large corporations. So this idea that we're operating in an environment of scarcity in a lot of ways is a manufactured crisis. The resources are there. It's a question of political will in terms of how the resources are spent. Having said that, I think that schools can make good use of the resources they have in ways that are sound pedagogically, but might not be the way that schools are spending money at the moment. So for example, there's a lot of money being spent on testing. Actually, the research shows that a quarter of all school time is now spent on either taking tests or preparing for tests. And that's linked into a multi-billion-dollar testing industry. So the schools purchase the exams, the computer hardware, the computer software for administrating the exams. So that's an example of money that's spent, and the research is really not clear that testing has a noticeable effect on increased achievement. The other area where you see a huge amount of money being spent is technology. And again, there's billions of dollars going to technology, and I would ask the question, pedagogically, is it sound to be spending money on computers and other sorts of technology in the lower elementary grades or the upper elementary grades? I mean, at what point, when you look at teaching and learning theory, actually if you interview the folks, they've done interviews with folks in Silicon Valley who don't let their kids use computers until they're older, and that gives you an idea. So there's, overall, I would say in this country, there's a move to corporatize education, and so a lot of money is going to large corporations, and if you took that money and reinvested it into what the research shows does work in terms of school improvement. So the research shows if teachers have time to plan, if teachers have sustained professional development, then you see increased achievement, but the money is not being spent in those areas. So when we compare test scores to other countries, so oftentimes you'll hear these media reports, the United States is lagging behind Japan, behind countries in Europe, and when you look at how they spend their money on teacher planning, because if you look, even if you did simple math, it doesn't take a genius to do the math, that if you're a high school history teacher, if you're a high school teacher and you have 5 classes and you have 30 people in each class, you have 150 people, and then if you assign homework every day and it takes 5 minutes to grade each piece of homework, so you multiply that out, and you could soon see that even assigning homework every day to the current load that teachers have at the high school level is pretty much insane. It just doesn't work out mathematically. So in terms of policy, I think oftentimes there are policies that are being made that are not linked, that there's no consideration to the systems in which the policies are enacted. And education is a complex system. So unless you see it as a concept system with multiple causes for issues and therefore multiple solutions to issues, you're not going to understand the root causes of the problems and the solutions to those problems. That when you look at the historical roots of why testing and quote-unquote explicit academic standards that at the federal level when did those come about and why, you see that the folks who were originally wanting to implement standards and testing was for a very ethical reason. They believed that there were schools and students that were being underserved. There was currently not, at the time, not pressure on those schools and school systems to serve the most disenfranchised students. And so their solution was to create explicit academic standards and tests that went along with those standards. Really, at first it was to provide guidance to teachers around how to teach in an academically rigorous way and then monitor that. So originally you had Democrats, Republicans, folks on the left, folks on the right supporting these academic standards and tests. What has happened since then, and you've seen this has also happened with the charter school movement, where originally charter schools were supposed to be engines of innovation. Of course, now we see in Michigan, for example, that 80% of charter schools are for profit, and that the research shows that there's no noticeable difference between, actually they underperform their non-charter public school equivalents, and that most of them use very traditional methods. So originally folks said, okay, if we create charter schools, we create quote unquote, competition, we'll see a lot of innovation, and we haven't seen that happen. The same thing is true with No Child Left Behind and the accountability demands that have gone along with No Child Left Behind, is that we have not seen the kinds of improvement that was originally intended. What we have seen in both cases, and I'll go back to what I said earlier around corporate takeover of education, is there are folks that are benefiting from this law. So back to the question of why why was that a very significant law that did not have, and why haven't there been many other significant laws at the federal level, is that it going back to being cynical, it achieved its purpose, which was basically to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what you do basically is you create these tests, right, and the money goes to the testing industry, and you start to make the tests so difficult that school, and so developmentally inappropriate, right? So you start to demand, for example, that all students are reading at the kindergarten level. And so I dare you to ask 100 parents, just do an informal survey, ask 100 parents, when did their children learn to read? And you'll see that there's sort of a wide, range of when young kids learn to read. So you take that wide range, you simplify it, you test it, and then you say, wait a second, our schools are failing because students are doing poorly on the tests. Well, you've rigged the game so that students will do poorly. And then once you've rigged the game, then you decrease funding for education because you say, well, schools are bad, teachers are bad, so now we're going to decrease funding. And then once you decrease funding, then the test scores go down further. And then once the test scores go down further, then you say, well, actually the state and corporations have to take over the schools because, the schools and local school boards can't improve schools. So it's really a cyclical, created cycle where public schools are, the laws are designed to make public schools fail. And then the money, let's be real, it's a $1.3 trillion, these are the words of the corporations, they see it as an industry. Okay, I don't see education as an industry. It is not an industry, right? And even if you look at words like efficiency, the public schools were created, one of the main reasons was to help young people become democratic citizens. Democracy is not supposed to be efficient. It's supposed to be filled with conflict, and I mean conflict in a good way. You're supposed to have people who are in dialogue with each other, working out pretty complicated, messy issues. Sometimes that takes time. And so we're living in a world that again is ruled by this corporate discourse where efficiency is seen as the ultimate end. And I would argue, there are certain goals in life, there are certain activities that we do that aren't supposed to be efficient. I think there is a fundamental aspect of education that is missing, and that is that schools should be designed to help young people grow and expand their life choices. And this is not a new idea. It goes all the way back to Dewey and further back if you looked. And so you have to ask the question, are schools currently designed to help young people develop and to grow and to increase their life choices? And I would argue that they aren't. One of the things that is missing typically in schools now, and it's interesting because a couple of decades ago, people talked with this language: we want to educate the whole child. I don't hear any talk of educating the whole child anymore. And also, we do these strange things with schools. We take these things called schools, we put walls around them, and then we have these things called communities. And so we have schools and we have communities, and then we have these things called families and parents. And somehow all three of these institutions are separate, which, if you think about it, is just ridiculous. All right, schools are part of communities. Children are part of communities. Children spend more time with their peers, with their families, than they do in schools. So a major piece of what's missing right now, I think, in the educational vision of what's going on in most schools is using the quote-unquote community as a focal point for thinking about the subject matter. I mean, why should we study history? Why should we learn math and physics? You can do all of that through investigations that start in the community, start to knock down the walls between schools and communities. And this is particularly important, let me say, for populations that have been traditionally underserved by schools. So, for example, when I was a high school teacher in East Harlem in New York City, and we had almost zero parent participation rate during parent-teacher night. The typical response to that is to blame the families for not coming. But then you actually, when you do some investigation, you learn that most families are working 2 or 3 jobs to survive. They can't come to school on parent-teacher night because they're working 2 or 3 jobs, or they have to take care of other kids. And so you look at that barrier, and you look at the fact that most of the families in that area had negative experiences in school, so they did not want it. They did not feel safe and comfortable coming to school. And then you look at education models that knock down the walls between schools and communities. So there are school models where you have health centers, writing centers, dental clinics in the school, and the school becomes a hub for community action. And then you have schools in which students and families and staff and community members are working to make the community a better place. And once that happens, you have a lot of communication between families and teachers and staff and students. The school is seen as a place that is good for the community. It's not seen as an occupying force. And so then you start to see, in schools like that, then you have a high level of parental involvement. And also, it's not rocket science. If you have daycare in a school, if you have childcare, and you offer parents, when you come for parent-teachers conference, we'll take care of your little children when you meet with teachers, then that removes a barrier. So I think there's not a lot of systems thinking when we think of schools. And one area that we need to think a lot more about is how to knock down the walls between schools and communities, because those really aren't separate things. So there's a couple of answers to that question. Yes, there needs to be higher teacher salaries. I think that this is the first generation of teachers, especially when you look at charter schools, that where this generation of teachers cannot afford college for their children. That's how low they're paid. You have master teachers in charter schools being paid $35,000 a year. So when you think of it that way, it's sad. It's disgusting how low teachers are paid. And the same thing in terms of teachers who are in non-charter public schools, where if you compare the salaries of teachers to other professionals that require equivalent knowledge, then teachers are really underpaid. Having said that, if you talk to teachers about the number one, number two things that would make the job more attractive, almost every teacher would say, I want to have less students so I could have more time for planning, and I want more time. I want to teach fewer classes so I could spend more time thinking, planning, working with students. And number two, they'll say, I want to be treated like a professional. And this gets to the point of your question, is that in terms of regulations, is that teachers right now are seen as the villains. They are seen as the villain. Now, what kind of insane society would treat the people who adults are entrusting their young to as the villains? Teachers are not the problem. Okay? The systems are the problem. And if teachers are provided with, one ingredient is money, but also time, and also being treated like professionals, then you'll see huge, I don't think this is the purpose of schooling, but you will see huge increases in, even if you want test scores, if that's your primary goal, you'll see huge increases in test scores. But more importantly, you'll see that the teachers are better able to help students and developmentally. If you look at ways in which equivalent professions treat each other, you look at doctors, for example. Doctors have professional organizations. Those professional organizations set their own standards. And so it's really an internal professional, the standards that are set are internal to the profession. There's quality review. If you go to a lot of other countries, they have quality review processes where teams of professionals will visit the school, they'll analyze what's going on in the school, they'll provide recommendations for improvement. But that's very different than the sorts of regulations that are part of policy now. The several of the most damaging of those is the new teacher evaluation system, where teachers are evaluated based on, I think it's at least 50% of their evaluation is based on test scores. And again, this is an insanity, because if you talk to test developers, the test developers themselves will tell you that the high stakes tests, such as the MEP, are not designed to evaluate students. It's one slice in time. It's one measure. You can't, and then if you look at experts in statistics, they'll tell you that there is no way to statistically, reliably link student test scores to teacher performance. It's not possible, because what you see is if a teacher changes what they teach in terms of subject, if they change from year to year in terms of the contexts in which they teach, so one year you're teaching in suburbia, the next year you're teaching in an urban area, then the knowledge that you have about how to perform in that context is going to change, and your evaluation is not a valid evaluation of your quote-unquote quality. So those sorts of regulations, such as the teacher evaluation system, also teacher incentives, so that in a lot of states have passed laws where teachers are given extra money if they quote-unquote perform better, and again, test scores are used there. So what that does is that creates a competitive atmosphere between teachers, and that's not what you want in the schools, because the research shows that schools that are successful are those that create high levels of trust and high levels of collaboration. So you actually have policies that are being enacted that cut against what the research says in terms of what works in education. I think that the whole mindset that sees students as outputs is completely misguided, and all that goes with it, the testing industry, the technology that goes with the testing industry, and at the moment that's linked to No Child Left Behind. So I think the research does not support that this is the way to go in terms of educational reform and change. And so, yeah, I think that the whole law is pretty much, unless we change that mindset, and if we change that mindset, then the law would look really, really different. So I think that mindset has to change, and I think that we have to be very honest. We have to tell the truth, and the truth right now, as you know, usually I kind of hedge and hog around, you know, the truth is relative. It depends on what perspective you take. I'll straight out and out say it, that corporations and foundations that are based on corporate money, like the Gates Foundation, trace where the money from Gates goes, and you'll see that Gates is putting in millions and millions and millions of dollars to drive reform in the way that it wants to. And so you have to ask, at the federal level, is it really in the public interest how these laws are created? Or are there corporate interests that are behind the laws to serve, again, to serve corporate interests and their ideology? So I usually, again, I'm a little bit more, you know, think that you have to look at different perspectives. But at this point, it's very clear. Exactly what you want on a video, right? At this point, it's very clear that corporate interests are behind the current laws, and that those laws are not based on educational research that's sound, nor are they based on the interests of communities, especially communities that have been the most traditionally disenfranchised. The other thing that I'll say that I won't, I'll say pretty passionately and clearly, is that at the same time that you have corporate takeover of education reform, you have anti-democratic governmental action. So if you look at Michigan, for example, where the Tea Party is very powerful, and I don't care if you are a conservative, if you are a Tea Party member, if you don't believe in dialogue and compromise, then you shouldn't be in government. Get out of government. You should not be a state legislator. You should not be a governor if you are constantly trying to ram through, for example, in our case, education bills, without talking with the professionals and without any kind of dialogue. So if you look at the laws that have passed through the legislature, they are rammed through without dialogue, without compromise, by people who are not experts in education. And so you have this corporate takeover of schools at the same time that you have the concentration of political power in the hands of the few, and those coupled together is a really deadly combination. I'm not saying I'm drawing a total analogy here, because it's not, but there are some similarities to the way education is being treated, was treated during the rise of the Nazis in Weimar Germany. If you look at the history there, Weimar Germany was a democracy. So this combination of political takeover and anti-democratic action with corporate takeover is a really bad mix. It's just bad. And so I think that we need to create a lot of community dialogue around what's happening, because there's a lot at stake. I mean, right now our democracy is at stake. If you are a high school student, if you are an elementary school, middle school student, then you have to think really, really carefully about whether schools as they are currently structured are preparing you to thrive in the world, or are designed to fit you into the vision of what corporations have for you in the coming decades.